Before a major race, a famous horse acts unexpectedly. Upon seeing an unknown young woman, he breaks free from his restraints and gallops towards her. In front of the shocked crowd, something surprising happens. The young woman mounts his back, and they both flee, leaving the famous million-dollar race behind. Before hearing what happened next in this incredible story, subscribe to the channel for more tales like this. The scorching summer sun beat down on the grandstands of Churchill Downs in Louisville, Kentucky. The excited crowd jostled, anxious for the start of the most anticipated race of the year, the Kentucky Derby. Among experienced bettors and families seeking entertainment, the air vibrated with expectation. In the paddock, Thunder's Shadow, a majestic purebred with gleaming black coat, neighed restlessly. His powerful muscles contracted under his lustrous skin, as if sensing that this would not be an ordinary day. The trainer, Jack Thompson, a middle-aged man with worry lines marking his tanned face, tried to calm him. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, running his hand along the animal's neck. "Today's your day to shine." But Thunder's Shadow seemed to have other plans. His brown eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for something or someone. The horse's owner, business tycoon Richard Parker, approached with firm steps, his impeccable suit contrasting with the casual atmosphere of the racetrack. "Any problems, Jack?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Nothing major, Mr. Parker. Thunder's a bit agitated, but that's normal before an important race." Richard nodded, not entirely convinced. "He needs to be at his best today. There's a lot at stake." Meanwhile, in the stands, a young woman with wavy brown hair and piercing green eyes observed the scene with interest. Dressed simply in jeans and a white t-shirt, she stood out from the glamour displayed by many of those present. Her name was Sarah Fields, and she carried a secret that was about to change the course of that day. Sarah felt her heart race as she saw Thunder's Shadow. There was something familiar about that magnificent animal, something that made her feel connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. Without realizing it, she began to move towards the paddock, as if an invisible force was pulling her. The announcer declared the start of the race, and the crowd exploded in applause and shouts of enthusiasm. The horses began to be led to the track, but Thunder's Shadow remained agitated, resisting Jack's efforts to guide him. It was at that moment that his eyes met Sarah's. Time seemed to freeze. The world around them disappeared, and all that existed was the connection between the young woman and the horse. Thunder's Shadow neighed, a sound that seemed like recognition and joy. In an instant, chaos ensued. With surprising strength, Thunder's Shadow freed himself from the reins that held him and galloped towards Sarah. The crowd screamed, some in fear, others in surprise. Security guards ran to intercept the animal, but he was too fast. Sarah remained motionless, unafraid. When Thunder's Shadow reached her, he stopped gently, as if he had found his place in the world. The young woman raised her hand, touching the horse's muzzle gently. "Hi, old friend," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. To everyone's amazement, Sarah mounted Thunder's Shadow with the grace of someone who had been born in the saddle. The horse neighed again, this time a sound of triumph, and together they galloped out of the racetrack. Richard Parker watched, the scene dumbfounded. His million-dollar investment, his champion, had just run off with an unknown woman. "Jack," he shouted, "call the police, now!" As sirens began to sound in the distance, Sarah and Thunder's Shadow were already far away, riding through the streets of Louisville, leaving behind a trail of confusion and unanswered questions. The news spread quickly. Social media exploded, with videos of the incident, theories about the identity of the mysterious Amazon, and speculation about the fate of the famous racehorse. At the police station, Richard Parker gestured furiously as he filed a complaint. "Don't you understand? That horse is worth more than many of you will earn in your entire lives. We need to find him." The sheriff, an experienced man named Frank Johnson, listened attentively, taking notes. "We'll do our best, Mr. Parker, but I must admit this is an unusual case." Meanwhile, on the city streets, Sarah guided Thunder's Shadow confidently, as if she knew every curve and alley. They galloped down avenues, surprising drivers and pedestrians, skillfully weaving through the chaotic traffic of the metropolis. The young woman knew she couldn't stay in the city for long. Her destination was elsewhere, a place that only she and Thunder's shadow seemed to know. As they left the urban center behind, Sarah leaned over the horse's neck, whispering words of encouragement. "We're almost there, my friend, just a little further." At the racetrack, the race had been cancelled, to the frustration of bettors and spectators. Jack Thompson was being incessantly questioned by police officers and journalists, all wanting to know how one of the most valuable and closely guarded horses in the country had simply disappeared. I can't explain it," Jack stammered, running his hand through his graying hair. "In all my years as a trainer, I've never seen anything like it. It was as if the horse knew her." The search intensified as night fell over Louisville. Police, cars roamed the streets, helicopters flew over the city, and TV stations interrupted their programming to broadcast breaking news bulletins about the case of the runaway horse. Far away on a secondary road leading to the countryside of Kentucky, Sarah and Thunder's shadow continued their journey. The young woman knew they were being searched for, but she also knew they had an advantage. No one but her knew their true destination. As they advanced through the night, leaving behind the lights of the big city, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: relief at having found Thunder's shadow, apprehension for what was to come, and a deep nostalgia she couldn't fully explain. "We're going home," she murmured, more to herself than to the horse. Thunder's shadow neighed softly, as if he understood and shared the sentiment. The full moon illuminated the path ahead, and the sound of Thunder's shadow's hooves against the asphalt was like a familiar song, lulling Sarah into memories of a past she thought she had lost forever. Meanwhile, back in Louisville, Richard Parker couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth in his luxurious apartment, making frantic phone calls and trying to understand how his perfect plan had crumbled in a matter of minutes. "Who is that girl?" he asked himself repeatedly. "And how does she know Thunder's shadow?" What Richard didn't know was that the answer to these questions was buried in a past he had tried very hard to forget. A past that now rode towards a long-hidden truth. As the night progressed, Sarah and Thunder's shadow approached their mysterious destination, leaving behind a city in uproar and a trail of unanswered questions. The first chapter of this unexpected story was just beginning, and the revelations to come promised to shake the foundations of many lives. The dawn painted the sky with soft shades of pink and orange when Sarah and Thunder's shadow finally arrived at their destination, an old, isolated farm on the outskirts of Lexington. The wooden gate, weathered by time, creaked as it opened, giving a silent welcome to the two fugitives. Sarah dismounted carefully, her legs sore from the long night ride. She guided Thunder's shadow along a dirt path to an old stable. The familiar smell of hay and aged wood brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome back, friend," she whispered, stroking the horse's neck. As she tended to Thunder's shadow, providing him with fresh water and hay, Sarah allowed herself to delve into her memories. This farm, once vibrant and full of life, had been her childhood home. It was here that she grew up, surrounded by the love of her parents and the constant company of the horses they raised. Thunder's shadow had been born in this very stable 7 years ago. Sarah, then 15 years old, had been present at the moment of birth and was the first person the foal saw when he opened his eyes. From that instant, a special, almost mystical bond formed between them. "How things have changed," Sarah murmured to herself, observing the state of abandonment of the property. 5 years ago, a series of tragic events had torn all this away from her. First, her father's sudden illness, followed by the farm's bankruptcy. Her mother, overwhelmed by debt and grief, had no choice but to sell the property and the horses. Sarah, still a minor, was sent to live with an aunt in the city. Thunder's shadow, the last foal born on the farm, was sold to an unknown buyer. Sarah swore to herself that one day she would find him again, but she never imagined it would be in such a dramatic way. Meanwhile, in Louisville, the search for the missing horse and the mysterious Amazon intensified. Richard Parker had called a press conference at the racetrack, surrounded by journalists eager for information. "We're offering a substantial reward for anyone who provides information leading to the recovery of Thunder's shadow," he announced, his voice tense despite the rehearsed smile. "This animal is not just a valuable investment, but a champion loved by all racing fans." Behind the scenes, away from the press's gaze, Richard met with Jack Thompson and a team of private investigators. "I want you to scour every inch of this state if necessary," Richard ordered. "That horse needs to be found before the next important race." Jack, however, seemed distant, lost in thought. Something about the previous day's scene bothered him, a sense of déjà vu he couldn't explain. "Mr. Parker," he began hesitantly, "there's something about that girl. I have the impression I've seen her before, maybe years ago." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about, Jack? How could you know her?" "I'm not sure," admitted the trainer, "but something tells me she's not a stranger to Thunder's shadow. The way he reacted to her, I've never seen anything like it." Jack's words planted a seed of concern in Richard. There were details about the acquisition of Thunder's shadow that he preferred to keep secret. Details that, if they came to light, could ruin everything he had worked for. "Focus on finding the horse, Jack," Richard said dryly. "Leave the speculations to the tabloids." As the search spread through Louisville and its surroundings, Sarah began to explore the abandoned farm. Every corner brought an avalanche of memories. The tire swing in the old mango tree where she spent summer afternoons, the porch of the main house where her father used to tell stories on starry nights, the small lake where she learned to swim. But not everything remained the same. The house, once so welcoming, now had broken windows and peeling walls. The pasture, once green and vibrant, was overgrown with tall weeds. It was as if time had frozen at the moment she left, preserving the essence of her childhood, but allowing decay to set in. Sarah found an old dusty photo album in one of the living room drawers. With trembling hands, she flipped through the pages, reliving happy moments. Her riding her first pony, her parents smiling proudly beside her, the arrival of the farm's first foals. One photo in particular caught her attention. In it, a 15-year-old, Sarah hugged a newborn Thunder's shadow. The connection between them was palpable, even through that image frozen in time. "I promised I'd come back for you," she whispered, tracing the outline of the photo with her fingers. "And here we are." The sound of a car approaching snapped Sarah out of her reminiscence. Alarmed, she ran to the window, fearing the police had found her. To her surprise, she saw an old blue Ford Fiesta parking in front of the house. A familiar figure emerged from the vehicle, making her heart leap. "Uncle Mike!" she exclaimed, running outside. Mike Reynolds, her late mother's brother and the farm's former veterinarian, hugged Sarah tightly. "My God, girl, when I saw the news, I knew—" "You'd come here." Sarah pulled away, confused. "But how—" Mike smiled, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "I've known you since you were born, Sarah, and I know how much this farm and that horse mean to you. I came to help." Mike's arrival brought not only emotional relief to Sarah, but also practical help. He had brought supplies, food, and more importantly, information about the ongoing search. "The police are concentrating their search further south," Mike explained as they prepared an improvised coffee in the abandoned kitchen. "But it won't be long before they start expanding the area. We need to think about what to do next." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of reality fall on her shoulders. "I can't simply return Thunder's shadow, Uncle. He doesn't belong to those people. He belongs here, with me." Mike sighed, running his hand through his graying hair. "I understand, sweetheart. But what you did, well, in the eyes of the law, it's theft. We need to find a way to resolve this legally." As they discussed their options, Thunder's shadow grazed peacefully in the field behind the stable, oblivious to the turmoil his escape had caused. For him, being here was like going back in time, to simpler and happier days. The afternoon wore on, and with it grew the urgency to make a decision. Sarah knew she couldn't stay hidden forever, but the idea of losing Thunder's shadow again was unbearable. "There's something you need to see," Mike said suddenly, getting up from the table. He went to his car and returned with a thick folder. "I've kept this all these years, waiting for the right moment." Sarah opened the folder curiously. Inside she found old farm documents, horse birth records, and a sales contract. "It's Thunder's Shadow's sales contract," Mike explained. "Look at the final clause." With her heart racing, Sarah read aloud. "In case of proven mismanagement or mistreatment, the animal must return to the property of origin at no additional cost." The glimmer of hope shone in Sarah's eyes. This means... Mike nodded, a smile forming on his tired face. It means we have a chance, Sarah. A chance to bring Thunder's shadow back home. This time, legally. At that moment, the distant sound of sirens reached their ears. The search was getting closer. Sarah and Mike exchanged determined looks. "It's time to fight," Sarah said, standing up. "Not just for Thunder's shadow, but for everything this farm represents." The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing across the abandoned property. Sarah and Mike exchanged worried glances, knowing they had little time to act. "Uncle, we need to hide Thunder's shadow," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. Mike nodded, his face marked with determination. "There's a trail at the back of the property that leads to a hidden clearing. We used to use it to train horses away from prying eyes. Come on, quickly." While Mike prepared Thunder's shadow for the move, Sarah ran to the house, gathering the documents her uncle had brought. She knew those papers might be her only chance to prove the legitimacy of her actions. With her heart racing, Sarah mounted Thunder's shadow, and together with Mike, who guided them on foot, they entered the dense vegetation surrounding the farm. The path was steep and full of obstacles, but the horse moved with surprising confidence, as if remembering every inch of that terrain. They had barely disappeared into the woods when the first police cars arrived at the farm's entrance. Sheriff Frank Johnson led the operation, closely accompanied by Richard Parker, whose expression oscillated between anxiety and irritation. "Search everything," the sheriff ordered his men. "The horse must be around here somewhere." Richard observed the scene with eagle eyes, looking for any sign of Thunder's shadow or the mysterious Amazon. His gaze lingered on the main house, noticing recent signs of activity. "Someone's been here recently," he muttered to himself, walking towards the building. Meanwhile, in the hidden clearing, Sarah, Mike, and Thunder's shadow waited in silence. The distant sound of the search reached them, increasing the tension of the moment. "Sarah," Mike whispered, "we need to talk about what happened 5 years ago. There are things you need to know." The young woman looked at her uncle, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mike took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal a long-held secret. "The sale of the farm and Thunder's shadow. It wasn't exactly as you were told." Sarah felt her heart tighten. "What do you mean?" "Your father," Mike began, his voice choked with emotion. "He discovered irregularities in Richard Parker's business shortly before he fell ill. He was about to report him when he got sick," Sarah completed, the pieces starting to fit together in her mind. Mike nodded sadly. "Richard used your family's vulnerable situation to pressure your mother into selling the farm and the horses, especially Thunder's shadow. He knew about the horse's potential, and he knew your father had evidence against him." Sarah felt a wave of anger and indignation course through her body. "So it was all a farce? A manipulation?" "Unfortunately, yes," Mike confirmed. "Your mother was forced to sign that sales contract, but she insisted on the return clause we found. It was her way of keeping hope alive." While this bombshell revelation was being shared in the clearing back at the farm, Richard Parker frantically searched the main house. His eyes widened as he found the photo album Sarah had left on the table. Flipping through the pages, Richard came across the photo of young Sarah hugging newborn Thunder's shadow. The color drained from his face as he recognized the girl. "It can't be," he muttered, the realization of the danger he faced falling on his shoulders. At that moment, Sheriff Johnson entered the house. "Found anything, Mr. Parker?" Richard quickly closed the album, forcing a smile. "Nothing relevant, Sheriff, just old memories." But the experienced policeman noticed the change in the businessman's behavior. Something wasn't right, and Johnson was beginning to suspect there was more to this story than a simple horse theft. Back in the clearing, Sarah digested the information she had just received. Her mind was buzzing with questions, anger, and a burning desire for justice. "We need to expose the truth," she said, determined. "Not just for Thunder's shadow, but for my parents, for everything we lost." Mike smiled, proud of his niece's strength. "And we will, but we need to be smart. Richard Parker is a powerful man and won't hesitate to use all his resources to silence us." At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps alerted them. Sarah and Mike looked at each other, tense, ready to flee if necessary. Thunder's shadow surprisingly remained calm, as if he knew there was no real danger. To their relief, it was Jack Thompson, Thunder's shadow's trainer, who emerged from the vegetation. His face was marked by fatigue and concern. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "You're Tom and Emily Field's daughter, aren't you?" Sarah nodded, surprised. How do you know?" Jack smiled sadly. "I worked with your father many years ago. I recognized you the moment Thunder's shadow ran towards you at the racetrack. That connection, it could only be you." Jack's presence added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Sarah and Mike exchanged uncertain glances, not knowing if they could trust him. "Why are you here, Jack?" Mike asked cautiously. The trainer sighed deeply. "Because it's time for the truth to come out. I can no longer be complicit in Richard Parker's lies." As Jack began to reveal his part in the story, back at the farm, the search continued. Sheriff Johnson, increasingly intrigued by Richard Parker's reactions, decided to make some calls. Something told him he was about to unearth a much bigger case than a simple horse theft. The afternoon wore on, and with it, the tension grew. In different parts of the property, secrets were about to be revealed, alliances would be tested, and the fate of Thunder's shadow, as well as Sarah's future, hung by a thread. In the hidden clearing, Sarah stroked Thunder's shadow's neck, seeking comfort in the presence of the animal that represented so much of her past, and now, her future. She knew the next few hours would be crucial, and that the decisions made there would shape not only her life, but potentially the world of American horse racing. "We're ready for whatever comes," she whispered to Thunder's shadow, feeling the strength and confidence of the animal flowing through her touch. "Together, we'll bring justice." Twilight cast long shadows over the clearing, where Sarah, Mike, and Jack formed a tense circle around Thunder's shadow. The horse, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, grazed calmly, his presence bringing a strange peace to the group. Jack Thompson, the trainer, looked like he had aged 10 years as he prepared to share his story. His face was marked by the weight of long-kept secrets. "I met your father, Tom Fields, over 2 decades ago," he began, looking directly at Sarah. "He was a man of integrity, passionate about horses and the sport. When Richard Parker entered the world of horse racing, Tom was one of the few who saw, through his facade of successful businessman." Sarah listened attentively, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mike, beside her, nodded silently, confirming Jack's words. "Richard always looked for shortcuts, ways to manipulate the system," Jack continued. "At first they were small infractions, nothing that drew much attention, but over time he became bolder, greedier. And my father discovered it," Sarah concluded, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded sadly. "Tom was compiling evidence, preparing to expose Richard to the Jockey Club and the authorities. That's when he mysteriously fell ill," Mike completed, his voice laden with contained anger. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken implications. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, the pieces of her past's puzzle finally fitting together. "Do you think Richard had something to do with my father's illness?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't have concrete proof, but the circumstances are suspicious at the very least." While this conversation unfolded in the clearing back at the farm, Sheriff Johnson was conducting his own investigation. Something about Richard Parker's attitude intrigued him, and years of police experience told him there was more to this story than met the eye. "Mr. Parker," Johnson called, approaching the businessman who seemed increasingly agitated. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about how you acquired Thunder's shadow." Richard tried to maintain his composure, but a slight tremor in his hands betrayed him. "I've already explained everything, Sheriff. It was a legitimate transaction. I bought the horse from the Fields family when they were facing financial difficulties." Johnson arched an eyebrow, his police instinct buzzing. "I see. And did you know Tom Fields personally before this transaction?" The question caught Richard off guard. Well, we knew each other by sight. The racing world is small, you know. The sheriff nodded slowly, making mental notes. Curious, because I just received some interesting information about Mr. Fields and certain irregularities he was investigating before he fell ill. Richard's face visibly paled. I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. If you'll excuse me, I need to make some calls. As Richard hurriedly walked away, Johnson exchanged a significant look with his deputy. Keep an eye on him. Something tells me we're about to unearth a case much bigger than a simple horse theft. Back in the clearing, Sarah was digesting Jack's revelations, her heart broken by the injustice suffered by her family, but also inflamed by an ardent desire for rectification. What can we do now? She asked, her voice laden with determination. How can we prove all this? Mike cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Maybe I can help with that, he said, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. Tom entrusted this to me before he passed. He said it was insurance in case something happened to him. Sarah's eyes widened. You had this all this time? Mike lowered his gaze, ashamed. Forgive me, Sarah. I wanted to protect you, but now I see that silence only perpetuated the injustice. Jack looked at the USB drive with a mixture of hope and apprehension. This could change everything, but it also puts us in great danger. Richard won't hesitate to use every means to silence us. At that moment, the distant sound of voices and search dogs reached them. The police were approaching. The clearing. We need to act fast, Sarah said, mounting Thunder's shadow with a fluid motion. Uncle Mike, take the USB drive to Sheriff Johnson. Jack, come with me. We're going to create a distraction. Mike hesitated. Sarah, it's too dangerous. You can't... But Sarah interrupted him, her eyes shining with fierce determination. It's the only way, trust me, Uncle. It's time we face this head-on. With one last concerned look, Mike nodded and quickly set off towards the farm, the precious USB drive, secure in his pocket. Sarah and Jack, mounted on Thunder's shadow, headed in the opposite direction, ready to attract the attention of the search party. As they rode through the dense woods, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, she was taking the reins of her own destiny, fighting not just for Thunder's shadow, but for the memory of her parents and the long-buried truth. The sun had set completely now, and the darkness of night enveloped the farm. Flashlight beams danced among the trees, voices echoed in the distance, and the sound of Thunder's shadow's hooves against the ground resonated like a call to battle. In different parts of the property, the various actors in this drama converged for an inevitable confrontation. Richard Parker, cornered by his own lies. Sheriff Johnson, determined to uncover the truth. Mike, carrying the evidence that could change everything. And at the center of it all, Sarah and Thunder's shadow, living symbols of an injustice about to be corrected. The night promised to be long, and the events that would unfold in the coming hours had the power to rewrite the past and shape the future, not just for Sarah and Thunder's shadow, but for the entire world of American horse racing. As she galloped through the darkness, Sarah whispered to her faithful companion, "Let's go, Thunder. It's time to show them what we're made of." The horse neighed in response, as if he perfectly understood the weight of the moment. The night had engulfed the farm, transforming it into a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. Sarah and Jack, mounted on Thunder's shadow, zigzagged between the trees, the sound of the horse's hooves echoing in the darkness. Behind them, the flashlight beams of the search team danced like giant fireflies, getting closer and closer. "Where are we going?" Jack shouted, holding firmly to Sarah's waist. "To the old training track," she replied, leaning forward in the saddle. "If we can get there, we'll have the advantage on open ground." Thunder's shadow seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, his powerful muscles contracting and relaxing in a perfect rhythm, taking them further and further away from their pursuers. Meanwhile, in the main farmhouse, Sheriff Johnson confronted Richard Parker. The businessman, cornered, was sweating profusely, his eyes darting back and forth like those of a trapped animal. "Mr. Parker," Johnson began, his voice calm but authoritative, "I think it's time you tell us the whole truth about your relationship with the Fields family and the acquisition of Thunder's shadow." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Mike's abrupt arrival, out of breath and with disheveled hair. "Sheriff," Mike exclaimed, extending the USB drive. "I have evidence. Evidence of everything." Richard's eyes widened in panic at the sight of the device. In a desperate move, he tried to grab the USB drive, but Johnson was quicker, intercepting it. "I believe we have a lot to discuss, gentlemen," said the sheriff, his expression hardening. At the abandoned training track, Sarah and Jack finally reached an open space. The full moon illuminated the oval track, revealing years of neglect. Tall grass, weathered grandstands, and long unused lighting poles. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, dismounting carefully. Sarah looked around, her brain working furiously. "We need to buy time. Uncle Mike needs to get to the sheriff with the evidence." At that moment, the first police vehicles emerged from the forest, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah felt Thunder's shadow stir beneath her, responding to the tension of the moment. "Jack," she said, an idea forming in her mind. "Do you trust me?" The trainer nodded without hesitation. "With my life." "Then give me your shirt and cap. I'm going to give them something to chase." Understanding the plan, Jack quickly took off his shirt and cap, handing them to Sarah. She put them on over her own clothes, creating the illusion of a man mounted on the horse. "Stay hidden and try to get to the main house," Sarah instructed. "I'll lead them away from here." Before Jack could protest, Sarah spurred Thunder's shadow, and the two darted across the oval track, their silhouettes outlined against the moonlight. The vehicles, seeing the movement, immediately gave chase. Back at the main house, Sheriff Johnson was examining the files on the USB drive, his face growing increasingly grave with each document he opened. "This is impressive," he muttered. "Mr. Parker, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Richard, cornered, dropped his mask of respectable businessman, his face contorted into an expression of fury and desperation. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I built an empire. You can't destroy everything because of a damned horse and a foolish girl." At that moment, the sheriff's radio crackled to life. "Chief, we've spotted the suspect at the old track. We're in pursuit." Mike's heart leaped. "Sarah!" he exclaimed, running for the door. Johnson, quickly assessing the situation, made a decision. "You," he pointed to one of his officers, "stay here and keep Mr. Parker in custody. The rest of you come with me." At the track, Sarah and Thunder's shadow flew around the circuit, the lights of the vehicles creating a surreal play of shadows around them. The wind whipped her face, bringing tears to her eyes, but she refused to slow down. "Come on, boy," she whispered in Thunder's shadow's ear. "Show them what you're capable of." As if understanding every word, the horse found an extra reserve of energy, accelerating even more. The vehicles, limited by the uneven terrain, were starting to fall behind. Suddenly, a helicopter appeared on the horizon, its powerful spotlight sweeping the field in search of the fugitives. Sarah knew she couldn't escape for much longer. At this critical moment, she spotted an opening in the fence surrounding the track. Without hesitation, she guided Thunder's shadow in that direction, praying the horse had enough strength for the jump. Time seemed to slow down as they approached the fence. Sarah felt every beat of her heart, every breath of Thunder's shadow. With a powerful impulse, the horse launched into the air, his front legs rising gracefully. For an instant, they seemed to float, suspended between sky and earth, between past and future. And then, with a dull thud, they landed on the other side, continuing their escape through the nocturnal landscape. The vehicles were forced to stop at the fence, their occupants watching helplessly as the silhouette of horse and rider disappeared into the darkness. However, Sarah's freedom would be short-lived. As they moved away from the track, she realized they were approaching a cliff. The moon illuminated the precipice ahead, revealing a dizzying drop to the river below. Thunder's shadow neighed, sensing the danger. Sarah, her heart pounding in her chest, knew she had to make a crucial decision in a matter of seconds. Behind her, the sound of sirens approached again. The helicopter hovered menacingly, its spotlight scanning the terrain. Sarah closed her eyes for an instant, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with determination. "Trust me, Thunder," she whispered, leaning over the animal's neck. "It's time for us to truly fly." The world seemed to freeze for an instant as Thunder's shadow reached the edge of the cliff. Sarah felt the horse hesitate for a fraction of a second, his muscles tense beneath her. The abyss opened before them, black and threatening, with the river shimmering like a silver ribbon below. "Now, thunder!" Sarah shouted, leaning forward and squeezing her knees against the animal's flanks. With a neigh that echoed through the night, Thunder's shadow launched into the air. For a surreal moment, rider and horse seemed to fly, silhouetted against the full moon. The helicopter hovered above, its spotlight capturing the dramatic scene. Time seemed to stretch as they fell. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the wind whip her face. Memories of her childhood on the farm, of her father, of Thunder's shadow as a newborn foal all flashed through her mind in an instant. With a deafening roar, they hit the surface of the river. The icy water enveloped Sarah, knocking the air from her lungs. For a terrifying moment, she lost contact with Thunder's shadow, the current threatening to drag her away. Fighting against panic, Sarah swam vigorously, emerging, gasping for air. To her relief, she saw Thunder's shadow a few meters ahead, swimming strongly against the current. "Come on, boy," she shouted, swimming towards him. On the riverbank, flashlight beams danced frantically. Voices shouted orders, and the sound of sirens approached. Sarah knew she had only a few minutes before the rescue teams reached them. With a superhuman effort, she reached Thunder's shadow, grasping his mane. Together they fought against the current, gradually approaching the opposite shore. Meanwhile, back at the farm, chaos had ensued. Sheriff Johnson, having witnessed the jump through his officer's radio, was hastily coordinating a rescue operation. "I want search teams on both banks of the river now," he ordered, his face a mask of concern and determination. Mike, pale and trembling, begged to participate in the search. "Please, Sheriff, that's my niece out there." Johnson hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, but stay close to me." Richard Parker, still in custody, watched the scene with a mixture of anger and fear. His empire was crumbling before his eyes, all because of a stubborn girl and a horse. Back at the river, Sarah and Thunder's shadow finally reached the shore. Exhausted and soaked, they dragged themselves out of the water. Sarah dismounted, her knees almost giving way beneath her. "You did it, boy," she whispered, hugging Thunder's shadow's neck. The horse snorted softly as if responding, but there was no time for rest. The sound of voices and barking dogs was rapidly approaching. Sarah knew they needed to move. With supreme effort, she mounted Thunder's shadow again. "One more time. Friend, we need to find a place to hide." They plunged into the dense woods, the trees offering welcome cover from the helicopter still hovering over the area. Sarah guided Thunder's shadow along almost invisible trails, relying on her childhood, memories, and the animal's instinct. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small hidden clearing. In the center stood an abandoned wooden cabin, almost swallowed by the vegetation. "The old observation post," Sarah murmured, recognizing the place. Her father used to bring her here to watch the wildlife. Dismounting carefully, she led Thunder's shadow into the cabin. The interior was dusty and full of cobwebs, but it offered temporary refuge. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief, leaning against the wooden wall and sliding to the floor. Thunder's shadow settled beside her, his warm body a source of comfort. "We made it, boy," she said, stroking the horse's neck. "Now we just need to wait and hope that Uncle Mike and the sheriff uncover the truth." As the night wore on, the search continued intensely. Sheriff Johnson, guided by Mike, meticulously scoured the riverbanks and surrounding forest. "Sarah is smart," Mike said, his voice laden with concern and pride. "She knows this land like the back of her hand." Johnson nodded, impressed by the young woman's determination. "She certainly gave us quite a chase, but we need to find her before she gets into more trouble." Meanwhile, at the makeshift police station on the farm, officers were analyzing the evidence from the USB drive. With each document examined, the case against Richard Parker grew stronger. "Chief," one of the officers called over the radio, "you need to see this. We have concrete evidence of fraud, result manipulation, and possible involvement in Tom Field's illness." Sheriff Johnson felt a shiver run down his spine. The case had become much bigger than a simple horse theft. In the faux hidden cabin, Sarah struggled against sleep, determined to remain alert. Thunder's shadow rested beside her, his rhythmic breathing the only sound in the night stillness. Suddenly a twig snapped outside. Sarah jumped up, her heart racing. Thunder's shadow raised his head, ears alert. Footsteps were approaching. The cabin. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the weathered door. The creak of the door echoed through the silent cabin. Sarah, her heart in her throat, positioned herself protectively in front of Thunder's shadow. The horse, sensing his companion's tension, remained alert, ears erect and muscles tense. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and a familiar silhouette emerged from the night. "Sarah," Mike's voice sounded like a whisper of relief. "Uncle." "Mike?" Sarah ran into her uncle's arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. Behind Mike, Sheriff Johnson entered the cabin, his countenance a mixture of relief and concern. "Miss Fields, you gave us quite a chase." Sarah pulled away from Mike, facing the sheriff with a mixture of defiance and apprehension. "Sheriff, Johnson raised his hand, interrupting her. "Before anything else, I need you to know. We've examined the evidence your uncle provided. The situation is much more complex than we initially imagined." Relief flooded Sarah, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of concern. "And Richard Parker?" "He's in custody," Johnson replied. "The evidence against him is substantial. Fraud, result manipulation, and—" He hesitated, looking at Mike, who nodded gravely. "And there are indications of involvement in your father's illness." Sarah staggered under the weight of this revelation, leaning on Thunder's shadow for balance. The horse neighed softly, as if offering comfort. "But it's not over yet," Johnson continued. "We need your testimony, Sarah. And," he looked at Thunder's shadow, "we need to resolve the horse's legal situation." Sarah hugged Thunder's shadow's neck, her eyes filling with determination. "He belongs here, Sheriff, with me, on this farm. It's his home." Johnson sighed, running his hand through his graying hair. "I understand your feelings, but legally—" Mike intervened. "Actually, Sheriff, there's something you need to see." He pulled out a folded document from his pocket. "It's a copy of the original sales contract. There's a specific clause about the horse's return in case of mismanagement or extraordinary circumstances." The sheriff examined the document, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "This changes things considerably." The sound of a helicopter cut through the air, rapidly approaching. Johnson checked his radio. "It's the rescue team. Let's take them back to the farm. There we can properly resolve all of this." As they prepared to leave, Sarah mounted Thunder's shadow, refusing to be separated from him. The group emerged from the cabin to find the night beginning to give way to dawn, the sky tinged with soft shades of pink and orange. The journey back to the farm was surreal. Sarah, mounted on Thunder's shadow, was escorted by police vehicles and closely followed by the helicopter. Mike walked beside her, a comforting hand on the horse's flank. As they arrived at the main house, they were greeted by a chaotic scene. Journalists crowded at the gates, kept at bay by police officers. Racetrack officials, veterinarians, and curious onlookers filled the yard. At the center of it all, Richard Parker stood handcuffed, his face a mask of fury and defeat. Seeing Sarah arriving mounted on Thunder's shadow, his eyes narrowed with hatred. "You," he shouted, "you ruined everything. Years of work, my reputation, all because of a damned horse." Sarah dismounted, facing Richard with a calmness that surprised everyone. "No, Mr. Parker, you ruined yourself, with your greed, your dishonesty. Thunder's shadow and we just brought the truth to light." Sheriff Johnson approached, his countenance serious. "Mr. Parker, we have a lot to discuss at the station. Officers, take him away." As Richard was led to a police car, loudly protesting, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters eager for a statement. "Sarah! Sarah Fields!" they shouted. "Is it true that you jumped off a cliff to save the horse? How do you feel knowing you've uncovered a corruption scheme in horse racing?" Overwhelmed, Sarah looked to Mike and Sheriff Johnson for guidance. Johnson nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Sarah addressed the reporters. "What happened in the last 24 hours goes far beyond me or Thunder's shadow. It's about justice, about correcting past wrongs. My father, Tom Fields, dedicated his life to horses and the integrity of this sport. Today I feel we've honored his memory. She paused, stroking Thunder's Shadow's neck. As for the future, I can only say that Thunder's Shadow is home. And, together, we hope to contribute to a new chapter in the history of American horse racing. A chapter of honesty, passion, and respect for the animals that make this sport so special. Cameras flashed frantically, capturing the powerful image of Sarah beside Thunder's Shadow, the rising sun bathing them in golden light. Sheriff Johnson approached, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Let's go inside. We have a lot to discuss and resolve." As the group headed towards the house, Sarah cast one last look at the property that had once been her home. With Thunder's Shadow by her side and the truth finally coming to light, she felt for the first time in years that she was truly home. The days that followed Sarah and Thunder's Shadow's dramatic rescue were a whirlwind of activity. The Fields farm, once silent and abandoned, now buzzed with life. Police officers came and went, collecting evidence and taking statements. Journalists camped at the gates, eager for any fragment of information about the scandal that was shaking the American horse racing world. Sarah, exhausted but determined, spent hours in meetings with Sheriff Johnson, lawyers and representatives from the Jockey Club. Each new revelation about Richard Parker's activities deepened the shock and indignation in the horse racing community. On a particularly tense afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in the living room of her childhood home, now transformed into an improvised investigation office. Sheriff Johnson, with deep circles under his eyes evidencing sleepless nights, leafed through a stack of documents. "Miss Fields," he began, his voice tired but firm, "the evidence we have is overwhelming. Mr. Parker not only defrauded race results and bribed officials, but we also have—" He hesitated, looking at Sarah with compassion. "We have strong indications that he was involved in the sabotage that led to your father's illness." Sarah felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Even suspecting this, hearing the confirmation was devastating. Mike, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand in silent support. "How—" Sarah started, her voice failing. Johnson sighed heavily. "Apparently your father was about to expose Parker's illicit activities. In response, Parker arranged for a toxic substance to be added to the horse's feed. The idea was to discredit your father, making it appear he was neglecting the animals. But the dose was excessive, and your father, who used to personally check the feed quality, he accidentally poisoned himself," Mike completed, his voice choked with emotion. Sarah closed her eyes, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Years of doubt and pain finally found an explanation, albeit a terrible one. "What happens now?" she asked after a few moments of heavy silence. "Parker will face multiple charges," Johnson replied. "Fraud, corruption, and now manslaughter. As for the farm and Thunder's Shadow—" He hesitated, a small smile forming on his lips. "Well, I think I have good news about that." In the days that followed, a series of hearings and meetings determined the fate of the Fields farm and Thunder's Shadow. Thanks to the clause in the original contract and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, the property was legally returned to Sarah. Thunder's Shadow, officially recognized as a victim of mistreatment under Parker's management, was placed under her care. The news spread quickly, and soon the farm found itself flooded with support. Former employees, neighbors, and even strangers touched by the story offered help to restore the property. Veterinarians volunteered to care for Thunder's Shadow, ensuring the champion was in perfect condition after his odyssey. A week after the rescue, Sarah stood on the porch of the main house, watching the sun rise over the fields she loved so much. Thunder's Shadow grazed peacefully nearby, his black coat gleaming under the golden morning light. Mike joined her, handing her a steaming cup of coffee. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Sarah smiled, a mixture of gratitude and determination in her eyes. "I'm thinking about how to honor Dad's memory, about how to transform this farm not just into a home for Thunder's Shadow, but into a symbol of integrity in horse racing." Mike nodded proudly. "Your father would be very proud, Sarah, and I'm sure that wherever he is, he's smiling now." Tour. That moment, as if responding to Sarah's thoughts, Thunder's Shadow raised his head and neighed, the sound echoing across the fields. It was a sound of strength, of freedom, of a new beginning. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, and the excitement of the opportunity before her. The Fields farm would be reborn, not just as a breeding ground for racehorses, but as a center of excellence in equine care, research, and ethical training. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, Uncle," she said, a determined smile on her face. Mike laughed, hugging her shoulders. "Yes, my dear, but with you in charge, I'm sure we'll make history." As the sun rose on the horizon, bathing the farm in light, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The path ahead would be challenging, but she was ready. With Thunder's shadow by her side and her father's memory guiding her steps, she would face every obstacle with courage and integrity.